The wind tears at us, dragging my breath from my chest as my son pushes us toward the cliff's edge. Still, I feel the cold steel of his hand on mine, like a vice. As the bitter sea air fills my lungs, I see his eyes, desperate, calculating. The same eyes I once held with love. That's when it hits me. My son is trying to silence us. His betrayal is clear, but it's my husband's voice. Soft, steady, the last whisper of hope that saves us. I never thought our own flesh and blood could lead us here. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Linda's feet skidded over the loose gravel, her body tilting dangerously toward the cliff's edge. The cold wind whipped her hair into her face, but it was the sickening rush of panic that made her stomach churn. She had mere seconds to make sure this wasn't the end, seconds before the jagged rocks below swallowed them whole. Her breath came in shallow gasps as Tom's hand clutched hers, his grip stronger than she expected given the weakness in his frame. His face, though pale, was focused, his eyes locked on her as if he could hold her steady simply by the force of his gaze. "Don't fight. Go limp," Tom whispered, his voice sharp and clear. The words cut through the chaos in her mind like a lifeline. She had no time to question it. She went slack, her body giving way to his guidance. In that moment, she let go of the fight, trusting him more than she trusted the ground beneath her. Evan's hands tightened on their arms, his fingers digging into their flesh. His voice cracked with tension. "I just need time. You weren't supposed to come today," he said, looking at them with a mix of desperation and rage. Linda could feel it then. The tremor in his voice was more than fear. It was a sign of something deeper, something more sinister. Sabrina stood behind Evan, arms crossed, her face an unreadable mask. She hadn't moved since they arrived, her stance cold and commanding. "Get it done," she said, voice flat, her eyes scanning the horizon. Linda's heart hammered in her chest. This wasn't just a heated moment. This was planned, orchestrated. Her son had led them here, to the edge. And Sabrina? She was the architect. Linda's mind spun. Had they been setting this up all along? As if on cue, a hiker appeared on the narrow path, his figure barely visible against the dark rock. For a brief moment it seemed as though the world had shifted in their favor. The man wasn't just a witness. He was a distraction. A chance for Evan to pull away from the brink. Evan straightened, all signs of tension melting into a polished smile. "Hey, everything's fine," he called out, too loud, too cheerful. His posture shifted instantly, slipping back into the role of the caring son. Just a little family thing." The act was too perfect, too rehearsed. The hiker hesitated, clearly unsure, his eyes flicking from one face to the next. Evan's grin grew wider, more forced, like he was hoping the stranger wouldn't notice the truth in the air. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, the hiker muttered an apology and turned, retreating down the path. Linda's heart pounded. The truth settled over her like a heavy fog. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. It was a calculated move, a plan. Her son, the boy she'd raised, had been preparing this moment. Sabrina, the woman at his side, had orchestrated it all. As the hiker's footsteps faded, Evan's posture slackened, the false warmth falling away. "Sorry," he muttered, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. "Thought we could talk, sort things out." Linda's stomach churned. She had seen this side of him before, but never like this. Never so cold, so manipulative. The realization hit her with a sickening clarity. This wasn't about anger. It was about control. Her gaze flicked to Sabrina, who still hadn't moved. Linda knew the truth now. The woman wasn't just a bystander. She was the one pulling the strings, the one pushing Evan further into this abyss. Linda's eyes narrowed. The game had changed. She squeezed Tom's hand, steadying him. "We follow his game," she whispered, her voice low, filled with determination. "Until we build our own." Tom looked at her, his face a mix of exhaustion and quiet resolve. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They both knew the stakes now. They had been pushed to the edge, but Linda had learned long ago that when you're pushed, you have two choices: fall or fight back. And Linda Calloway wasn't the type to fall. She turned her focus back to Evan, who was still avoiding her gaze. His hands were shaking now, the mask slipping again. Sabrina, on the other hand, was studying them, her cold eyes assessing. But Linda had seen enough. She knew what they were trying to do, and she knew it wasn't going to happen. They weren't done yet. Not by a long shot. The car hummed as Evan steered them down the winding road, the headlights cutting through the dark, the rain tapping lightly on the windshield. Linda sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Tom was beside her, his body slumped, but his grip on her hand firm, a silent agreement between them. Nothing had been said since the cliff, but the tension between them, thick and suffocating, didn't need words. Evan drove like he hadn't just pushed them to the edge of a cliff, like he hadn't tried to kill them. His hands were steady on the wheel, eyes locked on the road, his face the picture of practiced calm. Linda kept her gaze fixed out the window, unable to look at him. Tom, on the other hand, hadn't taken his eyes off Evan for a moment, his lips thin, his jaw clenched. His grip on her hand tightened every time the car veered a little too sharply. Evan finally broke the silence. "You both slipped. You scared the hell out of us," he said, his voice casual, the words dripping with insincerity. Linda could feel his eyes flicker toward her, watching for her reaction. He wanted her to bite, to show fear, to show weakness. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Tom's hand under the seat tightened into a fist. Linda squeezed his fingers, her mind racing. It was as if Evan was trying to convince them that everything was fine, that what had happened didn't matter, that the danger had been an accident, a misunderstanding. He was gaslighting them, twisting reality until it felt like they were the ones who had gone mad. Sabrina sat in the back, her reflection barely visible in the rearview mirror. She had been silent the entire drive, arms crossed, her lips curling slightly in what could only be described as a smirk, the same cold smirk she'd worn when they were standing on the cliff. She didn't care if they were alive or dead, so long as she got what she wanted. Linda glanced back at her briefly, her gaze sharp. Sabrina met it with a look of pure indifference, as if this was all just part of the game. Linda's stomach turned. They weren't done with her. Not by a long shot. The drive seemed to stretch on forever, the distance between the cliff and their home feeling insurmountable. When they finally pulled into the driveway, the house loomed before them, silent, as if it were a stranger now. Linda knew, without a doubt, that things would never be the same. Not now. Not after what had happened. Evan turned off the engine, the sudden silence between them almost unbearable. As he opened his door, Linda caught sight of him reaching into his pocket, pulling something out. She didn't need to look twice to know what it was: Tom's medication. He slipped it into his pocket so smoothly, so casually, as if it was just another part of the day. Tom's eyes narrowed as he watched the movement, and Linda's chest tightened. He had done it on purpose. Taking the medication, making sure Tom had no access to it. His small acts of cruelty were adding up. Linda's jaw tightened. They were not safe. Not in their own home. Not anymore. As they made their way inside, the house felt suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards seemed louder, as if the walls themselves were closing in on them. Tom's voice broke the silence, low and grave. "We're not safe in our own house anymore." Linda nodded slowly, the weight of the words sinking in. They weren't just at risk from outside forces. The danger was here, in the place they had always considered a refuge, a sanctuary. Their son had turned their home into a trap. "Then we won't fight him head on," Linda said, her voice cold, calculating. She couldn't afford to let the fear creep in. Not yet. There was too much at stake. She could feel the weight of Tom's gaze on her, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. They both knew what had to be done. The game had changed. But they weren't going to play by his rules. Not anymore. The moment they crossed the threshold into the living room, Linda's eyes scanned the space, feeling as if something had shifted. The house, the home she had built with Tom, no longer felt like theirs. It had become a battleground, and they needed to be ready for whatever came next. They weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for everything they had ever built. The house was quieter than it should have been. Linda stood in the kitchen, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her, the scent of it mixing with the tension in the air. Tom was in the living room, his eyes fixed on a folder of papers in front of him, his face taut with a mix of disbelief and anger. She could feel the weight of everything they'd just learned pressing down on them, thick and suffocating. Upstairs, Evan was holed up in his room, pretending nothing had happened. Sabrina was still lurking nearby, her presence in the hallway like a shadow. Linda could feel her gaze on her, cold and unyielding. The phone rang, breaking the silence. Linda grabbed it quickly, her heart sinking when she saw Evan's name flash on the screen. "Hello?" she answered, keeping her voice calm. "Mom, I need you both downstairs," Evan said quickly, his tone clipped. "We need to talk." Linda didn't ask what it was about. She already knew. She set the phone down and walked to the living room, where Tom was standing, his expression hard as stone. She didn't need to say a word. They both knew what was coming. When they reached the kitchen, Evan was standing by the counter, casually holding his phone. Sabrina leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed, her eyes assessing. The room felt colder. Evan dropped the phone back onto the counter and faced them. "I spoke to the bank today," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "They're giving me a deadline. I need your signatures on a few papers to clear up some things. We have to liquidate some of your assets. It's the only way to get this sorted out fast." Linda's stomach dropped. Liquidate. The word alone set off alarms in her head. This wasn't just about inheritance. It was a full-on attempt to take everything. Tom stepped forward, holding up a thick folder in his hand. "You forged my signature," he said, his voice low, dangerously calm. Evan's face flickered with something. Annoyance? Guilt? He quickly masked it. "That's not what this is," he said, the words slipping out too quickly, too defensively. "I was just trying to help." Linda's heart pounded. The papers in front of Tom confirmed what she feared. Their son had been preparing for this moment for months. He had been planning to strip them of everything, all while acting like the concerned son. They had been walking into his trap without even realizing it. Tom slammed the folder onto the table. The sound seemed to echo, hanging in the thick air. "You've been planning this for months, haven't you?" His voice was hoarse now, the anger breaking through. "You've been setting this up from the start." Sabrina's lips curled into the smallest of smirks, her eyes flicking to Evan as if seeking confirmation. The woman was cold, almost too cold. Linda could feel the contempt radiating from her. Evan shifted uncomfortably, his posture slumping just slightly. He didn't have an answer, not a good one anyway. He just stood there, eyes darting from one face to the next. He was a man who had backed himself into a corner, and he knew it. "This wasn't supposed to happen," Evan muttered, more to himself than to them. "I needed time, but you—" He looked up, eyes wild. "You just kept pushing." Linda stepped forward, her voice unwavering despite the fury building inside her. This wasn't an accident. The cliff wasn't an accident. You planned it. You've been planning this for months. Her voice cut through the tension in the room, sharp and final. Before Evan could respond, a knock at the door interrupted. They all froze for a split second, the sound of it sharp in the silence. Linda's heart skipped a beat as she saw Detective Alma Price standing in the doorway. "I got a noise complaint," Price said, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the tension without missing a beat. Linda's hand slipped into her pocket, her fingers brushing the business card she had taken earlier. She had known this moment would come. It was time to act. Evan stood, stammering for words, trying to salvage the situation, but Linda's mind was already racing. The truth was out. They had been planning this from the start, but now they had someone on their side. "Everything's fine," Evan said, his voice shaking. "We're just talking." Linda barely heard him. Her eyes were already fixed on Price, who was watching them closely, taking everything in. "Do you have a moment?" Linda asked, her voice steady, calm. Price's gaze lingered on Linda for a moment before she nodded. "Of course." As she stepped further into the house, Linda took one last look at Evan. He was sinking deeper into his lies, but this time it wouldn't work. This time, they had the upper hand. Late morning light poured into the kitchen, soft and golden, but Linda didn't trust it. The whole house felt staged, like a set dressed for calm when behind the walls, everything was rotting. Evan walked in holding a bouquet of sunflowers, grinning like it was Mother's Day. "Hey, Mom," he said brightly, placing them in front of her on the kitchen table. "Thought these might cheer things up." Linda looked up slowly from her coffee, careful to meet his eyes just long enough. "They're lovely, Evan," she said softly, her tone even. She didn't ask why he suddenly cared about flowers. She didn't need to. Tom was sitting at the far end of the table, flipping through yesterday's mail with slow, deliberate hands. His chest rose and fell unevenly, and Linda could hear the slight rattle in his breath. He'd barely slept the night before. Evan pulled out the chair across from her and sat, elbows on the table, that same practiced charm slipping into place. "Listen," he began, fingers drumming lightly. "I was thinking, we should probably update your will. Just, you know, in case of an emergency. It's smart to have things in place." Linda let the silence settle for a moment before answering. She tilted her head slightly, as if mulling it over, then offered a soft smile. "Of course, sweetheart. Whatever brings you peace of mind." Across the room, Sabrina leaned against the doorway, watching everything. She hadn't said a word since entering, but Linda didn't need her to. The woman's foot tapped rapidly, betraying nerves she couldn't quite contain. Her arms were crossed too tightly, her eyes flitting between Linda and Evan with calculated tension. She was expecting resistance, and wasn't getting it. Tom suddenly began coughing, a dry, hollow sound that made Linda flinch. He reached for the glass of water beside him, but his hand trembled slightly. Evan glanced over but didn't move to help. His face barely shifted. "You okay?" he asked flatly, not even turning his body. Linda was already by Tom's side, steadying the glass. "He's fine," she said quietly, running a hand over Tom's back once. When their eyes met, she could see it. The exhaustion, the fire just barely burning underneath. He nodded once, slow. "I'll go grab the packet from the office," Evan said, already rising. "We can look it over together." As soon as he disappeared down the hall, Linda moved quickly. She walked over to the side table where Evan had tossed a manila envelope earlier, documents half sticking out. She pulled her phone from her cardigan pocket and began snapping quiet photos. Financial statements, authorization letters, blank signature lines already pre-filled with forged copies. She had barely finished when she heard footsteps. She tucked the envelope back exactly how she found it and returned to the table. Evan re-entered moments later, folder in hand, acting like the loving, responsible son. He had no idea what she'd just taken from him. As he began laying out forms in front of them, Linda looked down at the flowers again, bright, harmless things that would wither within the week. "He thinks we're old," she murmured under her breath, more to herself than to Tom. "He forgot we raised him." Tom didn't reply. He didn't have to. And neither of them looked at the bouquet again. The cold wind from the ocean rattled the window panes, and Linda stood still at the kitchen counter, the faint scent of bleach still clinging to the air from her cleaning earlier. She wasn't sure how long she'd been staring at the glowing laptop screen in front of her, long enough that her eyes burned, long enough for everything else to blur out of focus. She'd told herself she was done, that she couldn't go any further, that she had already seen enough. But something inside her gnawed at her. What was she missing? She dug into public records, the ones that were easy enough to access. Birth certificates, property deeds, marriage records. Simple, routine things that hadn't seemed necessary until now. As her fingers danced across the keyboard, she felt a creeping sense of dread settle in her chest. And then it came. A hit. A marriage certificate, filed just 3 weeks ago. Evan Calloway to Sabrina West. Her breath hitched. She blinked, not believing what she was seeing. It couldn't be right. The date, the signatures, everything lined up perfectly. They'd been married, without telling them, without even a whisper of it. Linda's hands shook as she closed the laptop, the noise of the lid snapping shut echoing in the otherwise silent room. It felt like the floor had dropped out beneath her. She stood there for a moment, paralyzed, before the fury broke through. The cliff hadn't been about anger. It had never been about a moment of passion or a father and mother pushing him too far. It was about control, about taking what was theirs, one calculated move at a time. The door to the living room creaked open, and Tom shuffled in, his brow furrowed with concern as he saw the expression on Linda's face. "What is it?" "Lynn?" he asked, his voice tentative, as though he could sense the shift in the air. She turned to face him, and the weight of the truth hit her like a wave. "Evan married her 3 weeks ago. Sabrina is his legal next of kin now. Not us." Tom stopped dead in his tracks, the blood draining from his face. He didn't need to ask for clarification. He knew exactly what it meant. He signed his soul away to her. He muttered, the words barely a whisper, like a prayer. Linda swallowed hard, feeling her pulse quicken. It was so much worse than she'd imagined. The cliff had been a means to an end, but not just for money. It was about power. About securing their future through the one thing he knew they couldn't take back: their lives. Sabrina had been playing the long game, and Evan had walked right into it. Her mind whirled. But in the haze of it all, one thought kept rising to the surface, sharper than the rest. This could be their downfall. The marriage. Linda straightened, feeling something like a spark of defiance in the pit of her stomach. She knew what she had to do. "Then let's make their marriage the thing that ruins them," she said, her voice hard with resolve. Tom didn't speak immediately, but Linda could see the fire burning in his eyes, the same fire that had once driven him to build an empire, to create a life for their family. That spark had never completely died, not even after everything they'd been through. "Get the lawyer," Tom said, his voice low, but there was something fierce behind it now. "We'll play this their way, Lynn, but not for long." Linda didn't hesitate. She grabbed her phone from the counter and dialed the number she'd kept tucked away. It had been months since she'd last spoken to Jonah Reeves, the attorney who had helped them with a few estate matters in the past. The phone rang once, twice, before it was answered. "Jonah Reeves," came the sharp, no-nonsense voice on the other end. "It's Linda Calloway. We need to talk," she said, her voice steady, but beneath it, there was a quiet fury she didn't even try to hide. "Is everything okay?" he asked, a note of concern creeping into his voice. Not even close, Linda said, her eyes narrowing as the weight of the situation settled even deeper. We need to change everything. If they want the will, we'll give them one, the wrong one. She could almost hear Jonah's mind racing on the other end. You want to play them at their own game? Exactly. I'll need you to come in. I'll have some paperwork ready. We'll make sure they get exactly what they deserve. Linda could hear the click of a keyboard as Jonah began working on their strategy. She felt a cold satisfaction spread through her. Sabrina thought she had everything, thought she had won, but she was wrong. I'll be there in an hour, Linda said, already turning toward the door. Her mind was already spinning, making plans, finding every loose thread to pull. She wasn't done yet. She was just getting started. The kitchen was unnervingly quiet as Linda leaned against the counter, the weight of her plan pressing down on her. Evan sat at the table, fingers tapping anxiously as he leaned forward, eyes glittering with expectation. Sabrina hovered nearby, arms crossed tightly, her usual cool demeanor fraying at the edges as she sensed the shift in the room. You're right, Linda said calmly, breaking the silence. We should revise everything. It's been a while since we updated things. Evan's eyes lit up. He straightened in his chair, a grin creeping across his face. The mask of concern he'd been wearing fell away, replaced with an unguarded, almost childlike excitement. I knew you'd come around. We'll get this sorted in no time. I'll grab Sabrina and we'll make this quick. Sabrina's gaze flickered over to Linda, her posture tense. She was trying to appear unfazed, but Linda saw the edges of her composure slipping. It was always like this with Sabrina, controlled until she wasn't. The truth was she was just as eager as Evan, but far more careful. Too careful, maybe. I've already put together a list of the assets, Sabrina said, her voice brisk, her fingers already flipping through the papers. We can start with the properties and go from there. Linda watched her carefully, her face a picture of calm. Sabrina's eagerness was palpable, the way she rushed through everything too quick, too precise. It wasn't just about speed, it was about control. She was pushing Evan ahead, eager to see everything fall into place. Hold on a second, Linda said, taking a step closer to the table. She glanced down at the list Sabrina had started, pretending to inspect it. It didn't take long for Linda to spot it. The mistake. The first one. Sabrina had overlooked an important property in Sonoma, one they had held for years but hadn't updated on paper. Linda's pulse quickened. It was a simple oversight. One that could easily be fixed, but it was also a sign. Sabrina was moving too fast, too confidently, and it would be her undoing. You're doing great, sweetheart, Linda said with a saccharine sweetness, her tone feigning approval. But don't forget that property in Sonoma. We'll need to update the valuation there. You know, just to be thorough. Sabrina stiffened, glancing up at Linda with narrowed eyes before her gaze returned to the papers. She made a quick note, her fingers slightly twitching as she corrected the error. Linda had already planted the seed of doubt, and she knew it would grow. Across the room, Evan sat on the edge of his chair, his eyes fixed on the papers. What about the liquid assets? He asked eagerly. How much do we have in the accounts? That's where the real value is. Linda's heart hammered in her chest, but her face remained impassive. The liquid assets. That was the final part of the plan, and she had already moved them. The funds Evan thought he was getting access to were already safely tucked away. He wouldn't even know what hit him. With deliberate slowness, Linda slid from the kitchen counter and made her way toward the closet where Tom kept his old boots. She didn't need to look to know where the flash drive was hidden, nestled in the heel of one of his worn shoes. She gripped it tightly in her hand as she walked back toward the table, but Evan and Sabrina were too absorbed in their greed to notice. Just as she passed Tom in the doorway, his weary eyes met hers. He looked at her for a long moment, concern etched on his face. "You're scaring me, Lynn," he murmured, his voice strained. Linda met his gaze and smiled faintly. "Good," she whispered back, her voice steady, almost chilling. "They're going to regret ever thinking they could outplay us." As she slipped the flash drive into her pocket, the weight of it was more than just digital. It was the key to everything. The final piece of the puzzle, hidden in plain sight. Evan and Sabrina remained oblivious, too busy plotting their next move. But Linda knew the truth now. They had been playing right into her hands. She wasn't just going to protect what was hers, she was going to turn their greed against them. Linda's pulse steadied. The trap was set. And now, there was no turning back. She wasn't just ready for the final confrontation. She was already steps ahead. The house was unnervingly quiet, and Linda stood just outside the living room door, her back pressed against the wall, listening. Evan and Sabrina's voices were muffled but distinct. "I can't wait for this to be over." Sabrina's voice was sharp, filled with an impatience Linda hadn't heard before. "Once it's done, we're out of here." Linda's pulse quickened. She leaned in just a little, straining to catch every word. Evan's voice, hesitant but still eager, followed. "To where?" Sabrina snapped, a sharp edge in her tone. "To someone who actually wants a future." The words hung in the air, their finality cutting through Linda like a knife. The truth was clear now. Sabrina had never cared about Evan. He was a means to an end. Money, power, a place to stay. But Sabrina wasn't in love with him. She was using him, just as Linda had suspected all along. Linda felt the weight of the betrayal settle on her chest. Her own son, standing at the center of it all, was a pawn in a game he didn't even understand. The conversation shifted as the sound of Tom's coughing broke through the silence. Linda's head snapped toward the living room. She could hear the rattle of his lungs, the sound of his body failing him in ways no one could ignore. Evan's voice, dripping with indifference, floated through the air. "Dad? You okay?" Tom's hoarse response was barely audible. "I'm fine," he said, but Linda knew better. She could hear the struggle in his voice, the slow unraveling of a body that had already endured too much. Evan's eyes rolled, dismissing his father's condition as nothing more than an inconvenience. "You're making a scene," he muttered. Linda's blood boiled. It wasn't just the way Evan treated his father, it was the coldness, the ease with which he disregarded everything that had ever mattered to Linda. The truth was more crushing than she had thought. Evan wasn't the mastermind. He wasn't in charge. He was the puppet, and Sabrina was the one pulling the strings. Linda took a step back, the realization settling like a weight on her shoulders. Sabrina was the one who had planned everything from the start, manipulating Evan, controlling the situation, bending him to her will. "Puppets burn easier," Linda muttered to herself, her words sharp as glass. She turned toward the living room, where Tom sat slumped on the couch, looking frail, his breathing labored. He didn't need to hear the truth. He could see it in her eyes. Linda's resolve hardened. She wasn't just going to protect her family, she was going to expose the lies, the manipulation, and make sure Sabrina paid for everything. "Evan's not the mastermind," Linda said aloud as she approached Tom, sitting next to him. He turned his tired eyes to her, his voice barely a whisper. "No, he's not," Tom agreed, his voice weak but steady. "But he's still dangerous, and so is she." Linda's hand tightened around his, a silent promise. "We'll end this. We'll take back what's ours." Tom gave her a faint, tired smile, but his eyes were full of trust. She knew then that she wasn't fighting alone. She stood, her body energized by the rush of clarity. The pieces were falling into place. Sabrina thought she had won, but Linda was playing the long game now, and this time, the trap was hers. As she walked toward the door, she knew the final confrontation was approaching, and this time, she wasn't just ready for it, she was going to make sure Sabrina never saw it coming. The air felt different when Detective Alma Price returned to the house. Linda had known it was coming. Her gut had been telling her for days now that something was off. Price was too sharp, too observant not to notice the underlying tension. Linda could almost feel her presence before she even heard the knock at the door. Linda opened it slowly, careful to mask her anxiety with a neutral smile. Price stood there, her face more guarded than usual, eyes scanning the space behind Linda with a quiet, calculating look. Her expression was unreadable, but Linda could sense the shift in the detective's demeanor. "You called about a noise complaint?" Linda asked, the words sounding too casual in the quiet of the house. Price stepped inside, eyes flicking immediately to the room beyond. The tension that had been suffocating Linda for days seemed to thicken. Price wasn't here just because of a noise complaint. Linda could feel it. Something was different this time. "Actually," Price began, her voice low but steady, "I'm starting to get the sense something more is going on here." She glanced toward the living room, then back to Linda, almost as if she already knew the house held more secrets than it seemed. Linda stiffened, the weight of the conversation pressing down on her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice controlled but tight. Price took a step closer, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly as she studied Linda. "I don't know what it is, but it feels like there's something you're not telling me." Linda's heart rate quickened, but she kept her face neutral. She wasn't going to give away anything yet, not until the right moment. She had made a decision, and she wasn't backing down. Tom's voice broke the silence as he appeared from the hallway, looking frail but determined. He walked slowly to Linda's side, his breath shallow, his shoulders slumped from exhaustion. His gaze was heavy, dark with understanding. "Accidents happen at cliffs," Tom said softly, his voice a rasp that shook the air between them. He didn't look at Price, his eyes focused instead on the floor, as if he was treading carefully around an unspoken truth. Linda felt the words hang in the air like a threat, a warning. She saw Price's eyes flicker briefly toward Tom, then back to Linda. Price's posture stiffened, her body language sharpening like a predator locking onto its prey. "Are you telling me something?" Price asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous, measured tone. She was fishing, Linda could tell. Fishing for a confirmation. Linda didn't flinch. Slowly, deliberately, she moved toward the desk where she had laid out the forged documents Evan had tried to manipulate. She picked them up, the weight of the papers suddenly heavy in her hands. The lies were clear now, the forgeries unmistakable. She handed them to Price without a word. Price's fingers brushed over the papers, her eyes scanning quickly. Linda could almost hear her brain working, processing the implications. After a long pause, Price exhaled, her lips pressed tight in frustration. "If this ties to attempted harm," Price began, her tone serious, "we're looking at major charges. Fraud, conspiracy, endangerment, not to mention the cliff incident." Her voice trailed off as she processed the gravity of the situation. Linda stood tall, her eyes locked on Price. "Give me 48 hours, she said, her voice unwavering. "I'll get you everything you need. We'll have enough to go after them both." Price studied her for a moment longer, weighing the request, the silence thick between them. Linda didn't back down, her eyes steely with resolve. Finally, Price nodded, but there was a warning in her expression. "Don't become another case file, Linda," Price said, her voice low but laced with caution. "I'm trying to help you, but I can't protect you if you keep pushing the limits." Linda gave a brief nod, the weight of the detective's words sinking in. She wasn't naive enough to think she was invincible, but she wasn't about to back off now. "I understand," Linda said quietly, a hard edge to her tone. "But I'm not letting them get away with this." Price held her gaze for a moment longer before turning toward the door, her hand on the handle, but she stopped just before she left. "Be careful," she said, voice almost softer now, though the edge still lingered. "The deeper you dig, the more dangerous it gets." As the door clicked shut behind her, Linda exhaled slowly. The moment she had been waiting for was coming, but it was also the moment when everything would change. She turned to Tom, her face set in stone. "This ends now." Tom didn't respond, but the faintest flicker of relief passed through his eyes. He didn't need to say anything more. Linda had made her choice, and now there was no turning back. The game was on. The doorbell rang sharply through the house, interrupting the quiet tension that had settled over everything. Linda paused, still upstairs, just beyond the top of the stairs. She had been keeping to herself, giving Evan and Sabrina space to act out whatever twisted plans they thought were still in motion. But something was different this time. She could feel it. She heard the muffled sound of voices downstairs. Evan's was unmistakable, but the deep, guttural voice that followed sent a chill through her. Linda slowly crept closer to the railing, careful not to make a sound. A man's voice cut through the air. "Your wife owes interest," he growled, his tone low, dangerous. Linda's breath caught in her throat. She peered over the banister, just enough to see the stranger standing in the foyer. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a hard face that spoke of too many debts collected, too many lives ruined. Evan was standing frozen at the door, eyes wide with confusion and fear. "What do you mean, interest?" he stammered. "Sabrina didn't—" The man stepped forward, pushing Evan aside with ease. "She's behind, kid. Way behind. And it's time to settle up." Linda's stomach churned as the realization hit her. Sabrina had debts, massive ones, the kind of debts that could destroy everything they had. Sabrina had been hiding this, hiding it from Evan, from everyone. Evan looked stunned, his face drained of color. "How much?" he whispered, but his voice trembled as if he already knew the answer. "Enough to ruin you both," the man said, his eyes scanning the house, like he was already considering his options. Linda's mind raced. Sabrina had pushed Evan so far into this mess, using him as her puppet, but she hadn't been completely honest with him. The man's words echoed in Linda's ears. "Enough to ruin you both." From her vantage point, Linda could see Evan's eyes flicker between the man and Sabrina, who had appeared at the foot of the stairs. Her face was a mask of calm, but her body language betrayed her. Shoulders tight, hands clenched, her breath shallow. Sabrina knew exactly what was happening, and it was clear she had been hoping to keep this part of her life hidden. Evan's voice cracked, his emotions finally spilling over. I can't do this again. Not again." He looked from the stranger to Sabrina, desperation clear in his eyes. "I can't lose everything." Sabrina took a step toward him, her face cold but with a sharp edge of frustration. "You're going to have to," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. "Because we can't afford for your parents to be alive much longer. Not with all of this." She gestured vaguely to the house, to everything they had fought for. On the line. Evan's face crumpled, the weight of everything crashing down on him. "I can't do it again," he repeated, his voice breaking. But then Sabrina leaned in, her words low, just for him. "Unless you want me to expose your little secret," she threatened, her tone turning icy. "You know, the signature you forged?" Linda's blood ran cold as she watched from above, her heart pounding in her chest. Sabrina knew. She knew everything. Evan's face turned pale as he looked at Sabrina, his eyes wide with panic. "You wouldn't," he said, but it was a plea, not a challenge. "Oh, I would," Sabrina replied coldly. "You either do this for me, or I make sure you lose everything, including your freedom." Linda's hand clenched into a fist at her side. The truth had just hit harder than she'd expected. Sabrina wasn't just playing for money, she was playing for total control. As Linda slowly pulled back from the stairs, the weight of it all settled in. This was bigger than she thought. And now it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. They were all running out of time, and Linda knew. Whatever happened next, she would be the one to pull the strings. The air was thick with anticipation as Sabrina paced back and forth in the living room, her mind already far ahead of the moment. The plan had been set in motion, and now there was nothing left but to execute it. She turned to Evan, who was sitting on the edge of the couch, hands trembling as he stared at the floor. "You're sure about this?" Sabrina's voice was smooth, but edged with impatience. She hadn't expected him to hesitate. Not now. Not after everything they'd done. Evan looked up, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. "I don't know if I can do this again, Sabrina," he murmured, his voice breaking as he spoke. What if they don't? They'll come." Sabrina cut him off, her tone leaving no room for argument. "They always do. It's their nature to protect what they think is theirs. But you know what you have to do." Evan swallowed hard, nodding slowly. He stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him as if the weight of everything was crashing down on him. He looked at Sabrina, his face torn between fear and something deeper, darker. "I'll call them," he whispered, almost to himself. "Family closure. One last time." Sabrina's lips curled into a cold smile. She had him exactly where she wanted him. But there was no time for second thoughts now. Not after everything they'd set in motion. Tonight, it would all end. Upstairs, Linda watched from the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. She had heard every word, and she knew now what they were planning. Sabrina, always the strategist, had pushed Evan to this point, had manipulated him into luring them back to the cliffs, where everything would come to its final fatal conclusion. Linda's gaze flickered to Tom, who was standing by the window, his movements slow and deliberate as he packed a small bag. He was too weak for this, too fragile. But Linda had made her decision. They were not going to let this happen. Not again. As she stepped closer, Tom glanced at her, his face drawn, but his eyes were filled with understanding. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. "He won't get a second chance," he murmured, the words coming out with quiet conviction. Linda nodded, the weight of the night settling heavily on her shoulders. She couldn't show weakness, not now. Not when everything was about to change. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out the flash drive she'd hidden away. Evan's last mistake. The key to everything. Her hand shook as she slid it into her pocket, knowing that this was it. This was the final move, the last card to play. They had the power now, and it was time to take control. The phone buzzed from her pocket, and Linda pulled it out. It was a message from Jonah Reeves. "Everything is ready." The words felt like a lifeline, steadying her resolve. They had the documents, the strategy. All they needed was the right moment. Linda glanced over at Tom, who was now sitting on the couch, staring off into space, lost in his thoughts. She walked over, kneeling beside him, her hand brushing his forehead gently. "We finish this tonight, Tom," she whispered, her voice soft but firm. "No more running. No more hiding. This ends now." Tom's tired eyes fluttered open, and he gave her a small, weary smile, a silent acknowledgement of what she was saying. There was no fear in his gaze, only a quiet, steadfast resolve. He trusted her, and that was all that mattered. The phone buzzed again, this time a text from Detective Price. "Location pinned. I'll be nearby." Linda's chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow bursts. It was happening. Everything was falling into place. "Let's go," she said to Tom, standing up and offering him her hand. He took it, slowly but surely, and stood with her, as if nothing in the world could stop them now. They were ready. As they walked toward the door, Linda cast one last glance around the house. It had been their home, their sanctuary, but no more. Tonight, it would all change. She turned the handle, the door clicking open. The night stretched out before them, dark and endless. And Linda knew, with a certainty that burned through her, that this was the moment. They were about to take everything back. Tonight, they would finish it. And nothing would ever be the same again. The cliff loomed ahead, a jagged, unforgiving drop into the black waves below. The wind cut through the air, biting at their skin, as Linda, Tom, and Evan reached the edge. Evan was leading them, his steps hesitant, every footfall weighted with the heaviness of the moment. His hands shook at his sides, visibly betraying him. Linda watched him closely, her eyes sharp. The boy she once knew, the one she loved, was no more. In his place stood a man broken by greed, manipulated by a woman who had always controlled him. Evan's breath was shallow, his voice trembling. "It's almost over," he murmured, glancing back toward Linda and Tom, as though looking for reassurance he didn't deserve. But Linda didn't give it. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the stone, her movements measured, deliberate. Evan's eyes flickered to the ground, unable to meet her gaze. His voice quivered as he spoke. I never wanted this. I just wanted to make it right. For all of us." But the words didn't ring true. There was no sincerity in his voice, only fear. Sabrina, hidden behind a large boulder to the side, watched from the shadows, her cold eyes never leaving Evan. She had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the perfect time to strike. Linda felt her presence long before she saw her, like a predator crouching in the dark. Evan continued to shake, his hands now gripping his own arms as if to steady himself. I can't. His voice cracked, and for a moment, Linda almost saw the boy he had been. But that was long gone. Sabrina had broken him long before she ever laid her hands on him. Linda moved closer to him, stepping lightly across the stones, feeling the cold air bite against her skin. When she was close enough to look him in the eye, she spoke softly, her voice firm but low. "If you're doing it, Evan, do it looking in my eyes." He froze, his entire body stiffening at the challenge in her voice. His eyes locked onto hers, wide with panic, his lips trembling. For the first time since they had arrived, there was hesitation, a moment of vulnerability that Linda could almost feel through the air between them. It was almost like he was waiting for her to save him, but she wouldn't. "I can't do this," Evan whispered, his voice breaking, and suddenly he collapsed to his knees, tears streaking down his face. "I never wanted any of this. I just wanted things to go back to normal. Please, Mom. Please don't." Sabrina's voice suddenly erupted from behind the boulder, her tone venomous and sharp. "He can't even do this right," she screamed, her eyes wild with fury as she stepped into view. The coldness in her expression was unmistakable, a woman who had no loyalty, no compassion, only a need to control and win. "I did everything for you, Evan. Everything. And now you're going to ruin it?" Her voice cracked, a mix of rage and desperation. Linda's heart thundered in her chest, but she didn't move. Sabrina was here, in full view now. The moment had arrived. There was no turning back. Before Sabrina could take another step, a voice sliced through the tension, clear and commanding. "We heard everything." Detective Price emerged from the shadows, her presence like a shadow of justice descending on the cliff. Behind her, a group of deputies moved in swiftly, their footsteps soft against the gravel, closing in on Sabrina. Linda's breath hitched in her throat, a cold rush of relief flooding her system. The trap was set, the pieces in motion, and Sabrina's face twisted in disbelief. "No! No!" Sabrina screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the howling wind. She took a step back, her body tense, eyes darting for an escape. But there was nowhere to go. The deputies were closing in, surrounding her, a cage closing around a cornered animal. She tried to flee, a desperate movement, but one of the officers grabbed her arm with a firm grip. She fought back, kicking and thrashing, but it was over. Her struggles were futile. The lie had been exposed. The truth was too powerful, and there was no escape from it now. Evan, still kneeling, looked up at Linda, his face streaked with tears, his body shaking. Sabrina's capture, her arrest, should have been his salvation, but instead, it only deepened the weight of his own failure. He had been her puppet, and now he was left alone in the wreckage. Linda looked at him, her gaze hard but not unkind. "It's over, Evan," she said softly. "You've lost everything." And as Sabrina was led away in handcuffs, her screams muffled by the distance, Linda finally felt the weight of the years of manipulation begin to lift. She had fought for this, for the truth, for justice, and she wouldn't stop now. As the night air grew colder, Linda turned to Tom, offering him her hand. "Let's go home," she whispered, and for the first time in a long while the darkness felt a little lighter. The battle was over, but the war, Linda knew, was just beginning. The cold night air pressed against Linda's skin as the sound of Sabrina's desperate screams faded into the distance. The officers led her away, her arms bound in handcuffs, her eyes wild with fear and disbelief. It was finally happening. The trap had been sprung, the lies exposed, and there was no escaping the truth now. Sabrina had tried to play them all, manipulate Evan, control every situation, but Linda knew all along, and now, as Sabrina was taken away, Linda couldn't help but feel a strange mix of victory and sorrow twist in her gut. It was over, and yet, it wasn't. Evan collapsed to his knees, his body shaking uncontrollably. His face, streaked with tears, was a picture of complete devastation. "I didn't want to—" His voice cracked as he gasped for breath, his hands clutching at his chest as if the weight of everything was suffocating him. "She forced me. She made me do it. I never wanted this." Linda stood still, her gaze locked on Evan as he crumpled to the ground. For a moment she almost felt something for him. Something close to pity, maybe. But the words she spoke were laced with the harshness of truth. She couldn't afford to give him any mercy. "You chose her over us," she said softly, the words cutting through the space between them like a knife. Evan's sobs grew louder, his shoulders heaving with the weight of his guilt. "I didn't know what else to do," he whimpered, his voice barely above a whisper. She said she'd expose me. I thought I could fix it, Mom. I thought." But Linda didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Evan had made his choice. And now, he had to live with it. Tom, standing at her side, placed a hand on Linda's shoulder. His voice was soft, almost imperceptible over the rush of the wind, but it was enough. "It's done now," he murmured, his words steady and firm. Linda nodded, her throat tight with the weight of everything they had just been through. It was done. But the ache in her chest wasn't gone. It never would be. Detective Price stepped up beside them, her presence a solid reassurance in the chaos of the moment. She glanced at Linda, then at Evan, who was now being helped to his feet by one of the deputies. The look in Price's eyes was a mixture of understanding and quiet relief. "You're safe now," Price said, her voice low but strong. She turned her attention to Evan, who was still being guided toward the waiting patrol car. "He's going in for questioning," she continued, her gaze flicking back to Linda. "But you don't have to worry about him anymore." Linda nodded slowly, but the relief she should have felt didn't come. It wasn't that simple. Yes, Sabrina was in custody. Yes, the lies had been exposed. But something about the way Evan collapsed, The way he begged, twisted in her chest. Was it too late to save him? Was there anything left of the son she used to know? Her heart ached for the boy he had been, the one she had nurtured, loved, raised. But that boy was gone, and in his place, there was just a broken man, one who had lost everything. She turned to Tom, finding the quiet strength she had always relied on. His hand, warm on her shoulder, grounded her. "Let's go home," she whispered, her voice raw but steady. Tom nodded and they started walking, away from the cliff, away from the years of betrayal and heartache. Evan was taken into the back of a police car, his cries growing fainter as the vehicle sped off into the distance. But even as Linda and Tom moved further away, the weight of the night settled over her. The victory wasn't complete, not yet. There was still a lingering emptiness inside her. Grief. Not for Evan, for the son she lost long ago, but for the family they used to be. The years of love and sacrifice had been torn apart in a way that would never fully heal. Price walked beside them, her footsteps matching their pace. "You did the right thing," she said, her voice calm. "But you know this isn't over. There's more coming." "There always is." Linda stopped and looked at Price, her face weary but resolute. "I know," she said quietly. "But for now, we take it one step at a time." And with that, they kept walking, the night closing in around them. But Linda knew deep down, the hardest part was still ahead. The battle was won, but the war for their family's future was far from over. The morning after the storm had passed, Linda sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, but her mind far away. The world outside was peaceful, the sun casting long shadows across the yard. But inside, there was only a strange sense of finality. Sabrina's arrest had been the first step. But this was the real reckoning. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up and read the message. Jonah Reeves. "The real will has been filed. It's done. All assets are locked." Linda's chest tightened. The last piece had fallen into place. She glanced at Tom, who was seated across from her, watching her with quiet, knowing eyes. They didn't need to speak. He knew what this meant, just as she did. This was it. The culmination of years of lies, betrayal, and manipulation. She tapped out a quick reply to Jonah, confirming the details. The cabin was now slated for charity, the land designated for conservation, and all their accounts would go to a trust for at-risk youth. Evan received nothing. Absolutely nothing. At the county office, the paperwork had been processed. The will was official. And when the news reached Evan, it was like the world itself had shattered for him. He sat on the edge of his couch, staring at the message on his phone, his hands trembling. The inheritance he had fought so hard for was now gone. Every dollar, every property, gone. He looked up, eyes wide, staring blankly at the empty room around him. Sabrina, the woman he had trusted more than anyone, was in jail. And now he was left with nothing. He grabbed his phone again, calling his lawyer, his voice barely a whisper. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice breaking. His lawyer's response was simple, and it cut through the air like a blade. "You can't fight it, Evan. It's over. You have one option left. Sign away your parental rights. If you do that, we can try to mitigate the charges. Otherwise, you're looking at years of legal battles, and I can't guarantee you'll come out unscathed." Evan's heart sank. He knew what the choice meant. He was losing his family completely. He had already lost his inheritance, and now his last tie to any kind of redemption, his son, was being ripped away. He swallowed hard and sent the papers back. There was no other way. In the cold silence of the police station, Sabrina's fate was sealed. The papers had been filed, and the charges were mounting. Conspiracy, fraud, extortion, attempted harm. As the jail doors slammed shut behind her, her screams echoed down the hall, but it was too late. Back at Linda's house, the phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Detective Price. Price. Evans signed the papers. It's done. He's out of the picture now. He's leaving town. Linda felt a strange sense of relief at those words. Evan's departure from their lives was final. Sabrina's arrest, her downfall, was the last chapter of their twisted game. But for Linda, it was never about the money or the victory. It was about the son she had lost to manipulation, the family she had lost to greed. She looked at Tom, sitting quietly beside her, still and steadfast. He's gone, she whispered, her voice distant, hollow. Both of them. Tom reached for her hand, his grip steady and warm. We've got each other now. That's all that matters. The news spread quickly. The community, once shocked by the betrayal, now rallied around Linda and Tom. Friends, neighbors, even strangers began to offer their support. The story of the family torn apart by greed became a story of survival, of resilience. Linda and Tom were no longer victims. They were survivors. But as Linda sat by the window, watching the world continue, she felt a strange emptiness inside her. It wasn't just the loss of Evan. It was the loss of a family she once dreamed of. One that had been stolen by lies and manipulation. The battle had been won, but the war for healing had just begun. The path forward would be long, but as Linda looked at Tom, she knew one thing for sure. They would rebuild. Together. And the rest, as she always told herself, would come in time. The days following the storm had been quieter, the chaos of the past few weeks settling into an uneasy stillness. Linda and Tom had begun the slow process of rebuilding, not just their lives, but their sense of self. Therapy was a part of that, though it wasn't always easy. The weeks had blurred together, but in the space of those sessions, they started finding the words they'd been missing. They sat together, side by side, in the therapy room, Tom's hand resting in Linda's. His grip was solid, steady, and for the first time in a long time, Linda didn't feel like she was fighting alone. I thought we were done, Tom whispered one afternoon as they sat in the quiet warmth of Dr. Anderson's office. After everything, I didn't think we'd make it. Linda turned to him, her heart heavy but her voice firm. We're not done, Tom. We're just starting over. Each session was a small victory. Talking about the past felt less like walking through mud and more like a slow exhale. The weight they had carried for so long, the weight of betrayal, was still there. But now they were learning to carry it differently. Outside of therapy, Linda threw herself into the community. She started organizing events to raise awareness for elder care, something she had become passionate about during her time as a social worker. The work felt meaningful, purposeful. She could see it now, where her efforts were needed, where they would make a real difference. The community, though shaken by the scandal, rallied around her and Tom, showing support in ways they hadn't expected. As the town began healing, so did the land. The cliffs, once a site of fear, now bore a different kind of weight. It was the place where Tom's family's legacy was marked. The Callaway Cliff was officially recognized as a historical landmark, with a plaque commemorating the family's history, but more importantly, their strength. Linda stood before it one chilly morning, her fingers tracing the inscription, "The Callaway Cliff," a place of strength, where adversity was met with resilience. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of it all. The years of pain, the struggles, had been worth this. They had survived. They had rebuilt. Linda had been surprised at how much comfort she found in the support of Detective Price. What had started as a professional relationship had grown into something else. Price visited often, checking in on them, offering support when Linda least expected it. Over time, The detective's sharp professionalism softened into genuine friendship. One afternoon, as the sun was beginning to set, Price knocked on the door. She stood there with her usual no-nonsense demeanor, but there was a warmth in her eyes that made Linda pause. "You doing okay?" Price asked, a cup of coffee in one hand, papers in the other. "We're getting there," Linda replied. "One step at a time." Price nodded, sitting down across from them. "It's been a hell of a ride, hasn't it?" "Yeah," Linda said with a soft smile. "But we're still here." Tom, who had been quiet until now, placed a hand on Linda's. "I thought we were done," he said again, looking at her. Linda looked at him, her gaze steady. "We're not. The world wanted to break us. Instead, we bent it back." She could feel the strength of their bond in those words, an unspoken promise that they would continue, no matter what. As the days passed, Linda realized that the healing wasn't something that would come all at once. It wasn't a clean break or a sudden burst of relief. It was slow, methodical, and at times, painful. But it was real. And when Linda looked at Tom with his hand in hers, she knew that together they could face anything. The battle had been won, but their lives, their future, was still unfolding. There was still work to be done, still rebuilding to do. But this time, it felt like they were doing it with purpose. The victory wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was theirs. And that, Linda thought, was enough. The air was cold, sharp with the bite of the ocean wind as Linda and Tom stood side by side, their hands clasped tightly. The cliffs stretched before them, the same cliffs where everything had nearly ended. But tonight, the scene was different. The tension, the fear, the looming threat, they were gone. In their place was a quiet, lasting peace. They walked slowly, the rhythmic crunch of their steps the only sound, their shadows stretching long in the evening light. The world felt different now. The cliffs had been reclaimed, not just by nature, but by them. The place where betrayal had almost destroyed them had now become a symbol of survival. Linda pulled her coat tighter around herself, but the cold didn't seem to bother her. It was the wind of change, of something new beginning. Tom, walking beside her, was silent, his face calm but with that distant look in his eyes, the kind of look that came after long years of struggle. It was a look of peace now, not defeat. "Don't fight. Just hold on," he whispered, his voice low but steady. Linda stopped walking, her gaze lingering on the cliffs. She could almost hear the echo of those words from the night they had stood here before. Broken, desperate, on the edge. "You said that to me then," she said, turning to face him. "It feels like so long ago." Tom's smile was faint but genuine, a reflection of everything they had overcome. "It's different now." Linda rested her head on his shoulder, the steady beat of his heart grounding her. The wind howled, the waves crashed below them, but she felt no fear. The world had tried to break them, had tried to tear them apart with lies, greed, and betrayal. But they had survived. They had bent the world back. "We almost didn't make it," Tom said quietly, as though testing the words, like they were both still coming to terms with it. Linda's grip on his hand tightened. "We were supposed to be done, but we're not." Her voice held a quiet power, a strength that had grown through every trial. "We fought, Tom. We made it through." They stood there in silence, watching the ocean below them, the wind whipping through the air, feeling the weight of everything they had survived. The cliffs, once the site of their greatest fear, had become something else now, a reminder of their resilience. Linda turned her eyes to the plaque at the base of the cliff, engraved with the words, "The Callaway Cliff," a place of strength, where adversity was met with resilience. Her chest tightened as she read it again. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about reclaiming what had been taken from them. It was about finding their strength again, despite everything. Tom placed his hand over hers, his touch grounding. "I thought we were done," he whispered, the weight of the words still hanging in the air. Linda smiled softly. "We're not. The world wanted to break us, but we bent it back." She turned to him, eyes full of love and understanding. The victory wasn't about the money, or the inheritance, or even the battle they had fought. It was about this moment, about standing here, together, after everything. The past was never going to be fully erased. The scars would stay. But now, they weren't just victims. They were survivors. They stood together, their hands still intertwined, the night wrapping around them like a quiet final embrace. The world stretched out before them, undetermined, unknown, but they were no longer afraid. As the camera pulled away, the ocean roared beneath the cliffs, the sky deepening into a velvety blackness. The wind whispered, but Linda and Tom stood firm, their backs straight, their faces set with quiet resolve.